All right, let's move back across the Atlantic. You have been to the Ellis Island. You've been through that and you've seen the Statue of Liberty up close. Tell me about it. I see the catalogs here.
Yeah, you know, this would be the first time a couple of weeks ago that I actually visited the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island. I think there's a part of me, you know, that had a vague curiosity, but because of the information that I kind of already knew, I never felt really all that, you know, compelled to go. But I decided, and a really good friend of mine who now works and basically is looking at trying to improve a lot of things around, you know, these national parks. You know, he said, you should go, Joyce. So I went. And because I had already seen renderings, I'd been to France and was aware that there were various models of what the ultimate Statue of Liberty was to be, replete with chains. So I was very curious about how that would be handled. I also knew that the architect, the artist, and the you know, basically the producers, if you will, of the Statue of Liberty decided upon this statue in 1865. So of course this coincides with the end of the Civil War and the consequently the end to slavery. The chains, which originally were in her left hand and at her feet, were struck from the statue, clearly. But I was waiting for an opportunity on my tour to ask the tour guide. So the tour guide, you know, very enthusiastic man, he said, you know, he's kind of explaining all these details. And so right off the bat, he says, are there any questions? I said, well, my question is, what happened to the chains that were originally on the Statue of Liberty? And he looks at me and he goes, thank you for asking that question. We will cover it a little later. So I kind of waited, and we went through, you know, showing the dimensions and all of that, and I just waited. And finally, we got to the point where they actually had the different statues of those who were responsible for building the superstructure that it sits on, which is on top of a fort, all of these different things. And he said there was a little argument that went on. The artist wanted to really fought for the chains. He says, I really want those chains there. They were a part of acknowledging as a gift from France this idea of liberty and freedom, specifically one of the issues being the end of slavery, which of course the chains represent. And there were those in America that opposed it, saying we don't want it to be specifically focused on slavery, we want a broader sense of liberty. And there were all these various beliefs about why they didn't want it. So what used to be a left hand holding the chain became her clutching what looks like tablets. I said, well, help me understand how we reconcile. Send us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Help me understand how you reconcile that with the absolute obliteration of anything that suggests that slavery had anything to do with it. How did they reconcile that hypocrisy? And his answer was, I don't know how they reconcile what was an obvious hypocrisy. However, the chains are still there. I said, really?
Where?
Exactly. So I said, because I was there. I was literally there. And I said, well, are you kidding me? He goes, no, they're there. He says that was the one thing the artist fought for and won, that they would never be able to remove completely the chains. So then he pulled out the picture of the statue with the chains, and then he showed the chains, blown up picture of her feet, and there are chains there at her feet. However, they are not visible. The only way you can actually see those chains is if you happen to be in a helicopter looking down, okay, but from the pedestal. With a
zoom lens.
Yes,
to
with
get
a zoom lens.
Shot.
But from the pedestal, from anyone walking around, they are not visible. And I thought to myself, they are invisible like we are.
Let me ask you what might be a touchy question. Were any of the guides that you could see burnt of skin?
That would be no. Not that I could see. Most of the guys were European, and or of European descent. And part of, I guess, my concern is I was coming. You have to understand, there were huge groups of people. Among them were children. Among them were students from elementary through high school. Latino, African, all, these children, on their field trip to the Statue of Liberty. And I thought about that as an educator and thought to myself, how unfair, how unjust, how inaccurate for them to walk through and see no reflection of themselves, when in fact the originator had them in mind. And here these black children are with no clue, and I'm wondering, because I'm going back tomorrow. I'm going back
right,
because I want to see unasked if they'll volunteer the fact that those chains were there. Because I wanted these children who basically could go through, walk around and never know anything about these chains. And here's the other travesty. These are the materials they gave me. Anyone that comes, they'll see there's a Statue of Liberty one, and then there's the Ellis Island. There is no mention of it. Now, he showed it to me, but it's not mentioned in the literature. So again, it begs the question, why is that? Why is it erased? Then I went to Ellis Island, and then it gets clear why it got erased. So I come to Ellis Island. Now, you gotta understand, I'm ambivalent, because I recognize there's two things that are going on inside of me. One is understanding the whole process of immigration and folks coming over, even though they were not sure what the life would be, it was going to be a better life. They were choosing something different. Many of them, not all of them, but most of them, were looking for a better life, despite the fact that they had no clue as to what that would mean. So you come in, you're issued into a huge hall, and there's a room that I now learned is called the peopling of America. Whatever.
What does that mean?
You'll see. So I go in, and of course there's an entire tour. There's an audio tour. So I got the audio tour of a friend of mine and I, and they're talking to you through all of the little parts. But before you get to that, there's another room, which is the peopling room, peopled. So I'm over here and I'm looking around, and on one side, on my left, is a huge screen, and on my right is a chart. And on the chart are the little, figures of the number of immigrants coming in from particular countries, right? So you see a lot of them, a little bit, and you see years. And I'm looking at that, and then all of a sudden I notice that there's a little legend, and the legend says, I want you to hear this, it says, non-voluntary immigrants.
Non-voluntary.
And I'm thinking to myself, well, now, can they just not say the word slaves? I mean, but you see, it got sanitized. And one might think, if you saw non-voluntary, that they just kind of got lost and showed up. Maybe they accidentally happened upon the land. But you wouldn't know they came in the belly of ships, that they were raped along the way, that they were chained in their excrement. You wouldn't know that. You just think of them as, well, they're non-voluntary immigrants.
All right. Time for another break.
All right.
We'll be back after this. All right, let's talk about some present-day issues. There's an economic depression that some call a recession and argue about that. But what is your diagnosis of the impact that it is having on the African American community?
Well, I think just very simply put, those that are struggling or that have the less, economic means are going to suffer greater. And it's always been that way. I've often thought about the Depression, the Great Depression. And I, in school and even the media, there's an incredible history of pictures of people in soup lines, and there are pictures of people, families kind of living in this. It's almost never anyone black identified. Because if you were to contrast that with the black experience during the Depression, again, white man has a cold, black man has pneumonia. So what we're seeing in terms of this is a greater desperation on every level, economically, socially. Everything is becoming much more heightened in terms of the African American experience, because again, the having little and then having what you have that is there taken away is, there's a greater level of desperation, a greater level of fear, of anxiety, of suffering. So yeah, it's much greater.
Do you pick up much anger in the communities where you speak, African American communities?
Anger with regard
about
to
the greed factor that many.
But here's the thing, and this is being talked about quite a bit. That when people start talking about we're going to have this war on crime and war on drugs, and we're going to go after it, and what's depicted in the media, and we got numbers of police shows where you see them taking down the drug dealer and they're slamming them into the cars, and this is the drug dealer who had the little drug, and they busted it, and everybody's going, my goodness, how great. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? This is how you're dealing with the drug trade? The multi-billion-dollar drug trade is by Joe Kid on the corner selling drugs and arresting him and his whole crew and maybe his family, and now everybody can sit comfortably? And we've not considered the fact that, well, there got to be folks that export it, that own the planes, that own multi-billion. It's not him, but the distraction is him. And those who are struggling there down at the bottom say, excuse me, you're coming after me. How about the old boy that just went to jail that stole billions of dollars? How about him? Who's the bad guy here? And so what ends up happening is you create, and this is something that David Cole assessed. He talks about the whole idea of race and the criminal justice system, race and class, and the whole idea that it has an opposite effect. People are less likely to feel like I need to conform to the codes and the morals and the laws of a society that is not just to me, and that somehow turns its head when it comes to those who are really reaping the benefits economically of crime. And you pick the crime, white collar, blue collar, whatever collar you want. You begin to look at who's reaping the benefits of that. And they don't look like the people who we see on television being arrested. And so there is this kind of feeling of antisocial, if you will, a reluctance to embrace or to trust a system that identifies them as a culprit. And when we begin to look at it, when you unfold it in round, I mean, it goes on and on and on in terms of who's doing what and who's making the big bucks with crime, straight up crime. But once again, it gets sanitized, you see, because I don't know, they're wearing suits, they're white, I don't know, but it gets sanitized. So you have this kind of anger that's reverberating on the ground where folks are trying to survive. And no crime is okay, don't get me wrong. The crack dealer is no better in terms of his behavior and her behavior and engaging in that. But why is it this person here is demonized for that behavior? And yet these other individuals, I don't know, they get, luxury cells. And while they amass these fortunes and literally impact nations with it.
With the evaporation of jobs, especially in the African American community, this must cause great trauma in the household.
Well, yeah.
Can you talk about that?
One of the things that I live in Georgia, and one of the things that we're seeing is with the increased desperation becomes an increase in all other sorts of things, like, for example, stress and anxiety. So it has a physiological impact on people where the stress is producing illness. Not only is there that stress producing illness, but it's again producing a level of desperation where people are becoming much more fearful, not really seeing a way out in some ways. And so there's two things that happen. Again, I've said it before in the show. You implode or you explode, and both are happening. And part of it is economics. Part of it is it's relentless. There's no lift for it. And again, we have disintegration happening on a variety of levels because you have there's this kind of romanticized idea about America and what America, again, start going back to the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. One has to ask the question, where are these things for us? Now, the average person goes, well, if you just work hard and you just keep your nose clean and everything will turn out okay.
Work hard where? At what job?
This is my point. It's got to be your fault. And if you start looking at this in terms of Elizabethan poor laws, this come out of Europe. They considered it some sort of a moral, spiritual deficiency for you to be poor, and they put you in jail for it. Right? Something got to be wrong with you morally, spiritually, that you're poor. Right? So you have this kind of feeling that people, and then the guilt associated with it. Why can't I get myself, why can't I? Again, there are no resources, and particularly in your community. But then whose fault is that? Well, if you people would just, we don't own the communities.
Yes, I've heard that phrase.
See, so all of those things that are set up, and far be it for me to, to look at and simplify the entire dilemma associated with the economic system in America, but we have to appreciate that people, are hardworking, good folk just trying to do their lives. I see them all over the country, but they're demonized.
Okay. We'll be demonized if we run over too much. So let's try to undemonize. We'll be back. All right, as you were pummeling me in our station break, there's some areas that you wanted to ventilate on.
And two of them. The first area being kind of my final assessment in being in Ellis Island, and the other is looking at remedy and response to kind of a parallel process from Africa to here. When I told you I saw the thing about Africans, which is the only thing you see about black people is the non-voluntary immigrants, and then there's a huge screen which if you don't pay attention closely, it looks like some beautiful parts of the country. It's a moving kind of video thing. Mm-hmm. That's about natives and the number of tribes that it started off, and then how they were, quote, reduced. Again, we're going to clean that up because we're not going to talk about, well, they talk about the diseases that affected them, but how about what, well, amounts to genocide? Okay, those words aren't used. Slaughter, genocide. No, reduced numbers. Then we move on, and what I want to speak to is when we start talking about how do we remedy this, how do we teach children of color, in particular in America, African American children, to feel good about who they are, to strive, to want to achieve, to not feel helpless or victimized or any of those things that people get all twisted about. We go through, and you get to a point where it goes, imagine what it would feel like. A place you've never been, you don't know if you're going to be able to stay or go. Imagine what it must feel like living in these quarters. And I'm looking at the quarters, and these are like bunks, hammocks, 2 sinks. Looks pretty good to me, right? I'm going, imagine what those non-voluntary immigrants experience. And if you're going to put this picture up, put that one up too. How dare you ignore? Because you want me to empathize. You want me to feel the struggle and the suffering and the fear, and I'm okay with that. But who cries for them? The 10,000 buried in the African burial ground that's not on the tour. Where is the empathy for them? Where is the headphones saying, imagine? Not only not wanting to go, not knowing where you're going to go, and having your children, your wives, your people raped in front of you. Imagine that. Not wanting to go and not knowing where you're going. Where is the picture there? They were issued into another room where they say, and then they underwent medical prodding to determine if they were fit to stay or they were going to be sent back. And in this case, and I look closely because you know me, I look closely because I said, possibly could it be 1800s? We got to find J. Marion Sims in here, and surely his speculum is there. The speculum used to evaluate European women coming through. But did they tell you when they showed you Sims' instruments, the one who's standing in Central Park, that those instruments were developed by experimenting on black women? No, you see, that's not said. It just says, look at this instrument he developed, and these poor women had to undergo these sorts of examinations. Do you see? Mm-hmm. And so I'm watching this, and while I can empathize with that, who empathized? Where are the tears? Where are the tears? Where's the empathy of America? And that, to me, is part of the problem with why we're seeing a society of people who are done.
When we were on our way to the studio, you mentioned the desire to drop some reality around the shoulders of Thomas Jefferson.
Yes, and again, it's if people would read it, it's really clearly there. Thomas Jefferson, and in the close of my book, the soliloquy of Thomas Jefferson was fully aware of what the impact of the long-term impact of enslavement would be on white people and black people, and everybody in between that were confused. He talked about the horror associated with slave masters did, and that their children imitated the behavior among their friends and younger children that were enslaved, and that built into a sickness on the part of Europeans and a hatred and antipathy on the part of Africans. And his greatest fear is that it would end in the extermination of one or the other race. He says, because God cannot side with us, meaning Europeans, in this contest. He cannot side with us, which means God will side with them. And it is only his hope. He says, indeed, I tremble for my country when I consider that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. So Thomas Jefferson not only knew at the time the wrongness associated, but recognized the long-term impact that it would have. Clearly, these are his words. I'm not making this up. But again, it somehow gets absent of the curriculum. Somehow it gets removed, and we talk about all the other things that he was able to expound upon. And I think that if we're talking about healing, if we're talking about a response, we have to look and understand historically how the injury transmitted itself, what it looks like then, now, and then contrast that with Africa.
How can there be any healing if you don't get the right medicine?
First of all, here's how it's got to start. It's got to start with unearthing the truth.
Yes.
Got to first start there. But you see, again, you have to ask this other question. What is the fear? I always look at these things and go, what is the fear of unmasking it? What will that mean? Not just to the people themselves, like Native people and African people and Latinos. What will it mean for Europeans to unmask it? And like I said very clearly, it'll mean little Brittany and little Tommy will see a different face of the America that they've been taught about. They will see something that isn't pleasant, hence non-voluntary immigrant, instead of enslaved people who were sold and chained and bred like animals. You see, that's a different picture. So what will it mean to unravel it? It'll mean that people have to look at this square, and they're going to have to own what has happened and recognize that this history is an important history. It is American history. And yet there is this feeling like, well, it's just so unpleasant. Those chains, wouldn't that be unpleasant to see those chains on the Statue of Liberty? Not if those chains represented what they were supposed to represent, and that was true freedom. It wouldn't be a sense of shame, it would be a sense of pride. But because it didn't do that, send us your tired, your poor, did not happen for people of African descent. Those chains would spell the total oppression which has occurred up until the current recent apology by the House of Representatives.
Okay. Another break. We'll be back. So you're saying that not only do people of African descent need to have this therapeutic process in order to regain self-esteem and motive to move forward, but whites need it too.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. You know, that the absence of this truth is a perpetuation of an ignorance that will result in all of our demise. And so what I think is that the fear associated with the truth, I think, is what is creating the problem. And I think once you get it out, we can begin to extricate it. We can begin to deal with it. But there's been so much denial, fear, guilt, pain, all of those things associated with these truths that we don't recognize that this thing is festering into a hot mess that doesn't have to. One of the things, again, the purpose of my work and even looking at this is, you know, not only was it a part of my own kind of growth and development, but my purpose was to try to look at what did we lose along the way, what do we need to recapture. So my focus right now, which is, you know, all of my work is really focused on healing. It's all focused on education on learning. So the first learning was, what was it like in Africa? What is it like in Africa as it relates to Africans? What was injured through American chattel slavery and the oppressive eras that followed American chattel slavery was the destruction of relationships. If you were to kind of boil it down, and I want you to stay with that theme because it is the focus, the matrix, if you will, that we use to get back through. And part of it is to look at what were relationships like. Well, it was collective, people worked together, there was this whole sense of tribe, the connection to the land, all those things. Then you had chattel slavery, folks getting ripped off, taken places, traumatized, untreated by that trauma, continuing perpetual trauma. What did that result in? Well, from an African vantage point, as a result of that collective, that village, you have respect, you have honor, you have nobility, you have this sense of self, trust, all of this. Now, what do you have when you have a destruction of those relationships?
Chaos.
The polar opposite. You have the polar opposite of that. You have people who are suspicious, who are fearful, who are distrustful, are not willing to work with other people, that have fragmented senses of themselves and other people, and thus you have this kind of fractioning that continues to happen. So a question that comes up with, weren't we doing better at some point? That's always a question. And the truth is we were. During segregation, we started doing better because we started having to deal with things on our own and building some sense of that community back. Then it got fragmented by, hey guys, come on over here, we'll treat you like everybody else. So now we want your money, we want your community, we want your land, we want all of that in exchange for equality. Well, that wasn't true. Clearly wasn't true. So what happens then? So now what we're left with is this response. We're left with this fragmentation. The key is through the relationships. Recently on Black in America, there's a gentleman shown. This gentleman has a 100% success rate of getting young black students in college. 100%. I'm so happy he was there. The natural question I would ask is, hey, I got it. Let's replicate that. How about we replicate it? Because this is not rocket science here. But what does he have? And the reason why it's not so easily replicable is because it's him. Okay? Hence, he has a relationship with those children. He picked them up. He put them in his car. He put his heart, his soul, his life. Can you replicate him? Well, he's not the only one. But I would venture to say, and I would submit to you, every program, whether it's rehabilitative, whether you're dealing with youth, after-school programs, any of them, that the common element is relationship. Because you see, that's what's fractured. If I believe you trust me, you believe in me, you love me, young, old, in between, it is going to foster a sense that is going to have me not only believe but achieve. And that's something, an element, not rocket science. Look at any program. And you'll find that, well, when it comes down to it, they cared about me. They worked with me. They were there for me. They had my back. Those are all statements which suggest a relationship, which was firmly said at one point, that became fractioned now. So how do we get it back? How do we begin to create those things? You can't create a person, but that heart, that spirit is all over this country. It's black. It's not always black. You'll find it, like how do you replicate Mother Teresa? Okay? She was who she was. Martin Luther King, Malcolm. You see, there were those who have always would arise who felt that. But there are also many people who feel it. And that's the key, is to heal the relationship where it is. Where it is. And those young people believe in him. I would venture to say that sometimes programs here that are rehabilitative, prison, whatever it is, that when that person is removed, you throw money at it. Let's get 4 more buses. Then you get further away from what? The relationship. And you begin to see a different result. Because of the nature of the injury, it is the relationship that is most critical.
Okay, time for a last break. Malcolm X once said that land is the basis of independence, and it moves me to ask a question. Can you name any part of this planet where we dwell and control the economy where we dwell?
Sometimes we look like we control the economy? I don't know. Honestly, I'm sure there are areas, probably not very large.
Like this?
Yeah, not very large.
Where would you place that in your agenda for
Healing?
some healing?
Well, economics is right up there at the top. It really is. I mean, so much of this has to do with, again, there's a point at which you don't care if you like me. It's not about you liking me. It's about me having the right to exist and to be independent and to be able to survive in my environment in a manner that is appropriate and fair and just. So justice is critical, and justice implies equity as it relates to financial issues, and we know that that's huge. Of course, everybody knows it's huge right now.
Because it's a shock to go to Africa and see the total domination of African countries by Europeans.
And Chinese. Yeah, at this point. Yeah, Chinese.
In growing numbers, right?
In growing numbers. And again, I think that we have to recognize that we have to function as a global society. And a global society has responsibilities. Now, we can ignore that if we'd like. And I think that just like we ignore the global ecological system, you can ignore it if you like, but it eventually comes back to get you. All of us, And I think similarly, as we begin to look at these economies of countries all over the world, we look at the Sudan, and we look at, things that have gone on. It's just basically we've turned a deaf ear. Ultimately, that's going to reverberate back because we are a global society.
And what goes around? It
comes around, And really, I think that there has to be a matrix, and I am, of course, on the side of the hands-on, working with people, and that's great. But at the end of the day, they don't have a place to live and can't eat and can't work. I don't care how good that make them feel. Okay, I don't care how clear they are about their identity or their connection to their ancestral roots. If I don't have a place to sleep, I cannot gain food, I cannot care for myself or my family. Now we have a whole nother ball of wax. You see, it has to be a parallel process that not only must we start looking at ourselves and, getting rid of certain behaviors, which I created a matrix to do that. We can begin to extricate that.
How can we self-examine? By what process? There
are a lot of processes, I think. The one that I've created and the one that, I've been working so long, looking at this enough to go, okay, so how does one look at oneself? In my study guide, which is now printed and will be available very, very soon, within weeks. This study guide, there are parts of it where there's a matrix. So I give you examples from the book of what is vacant esteem, what is racist socialization, what is anger, what does that look like, starting with enslavement. Well, those are clear. There's certain behaviors that happen, and then there are behaviors that came out of that: self-hatred, good hair, light-skinned. What is that term? High, yellow, gone to waste. Crazy stuff, right? You have that. You have this anger, this distrust, this ambivalence that you have to deal with. And then you have this socialization process which continues to lie to you. Well, how do you begin to eradicate that? Then you look at it. What does it look like in my family? For example, you look at your own family, brings you all the way down to yourself. And then it says, what is your response with all you know now? Now that I understand where it came from, I understand what it started to look like, then I looked at how Mama and Grandpa and cousin and Pookie dealt with it. Now I got to ask myself, with all this knowledge, what am I going to do? How am I going to perceive myself? Am I a Negro? Am I colored? Am I the N-word? Am I black? Am I African? What are you going to tell your children? And what of that information as you go through this matrix, this flow chart that helps you see it? What of that information is going to change now that you're going to share with the other generation? Not just with my family, but with the kid down the street and in the schools and within systems. How does one look at it? But you got to first be able to see the flow. That's the problem. We see enslavement. We don't see what it got to do with us. You got black kids right now that go, Afro, I don't got nothing to do with Africa. Right now. I don't have nothing to do with Africa. And if you look at the lyrics of Lil Wayne, it's scary, right? So you have all these different things. How did that happen? Where did it go amiss? That's why there has to be an assessment process. That's personally. On the flip side, there has to be justice. Has to be justice. Because while all of this is going on, there has to be a system by which I can plug into that is just, fair, equitable to me, and safe. So one cannot happen without the other. There's a matrix. We can certainly work
Power
with that.
concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will.
Never will.
Frederick Douglass said that.
That's right. That's right.
You concur?
I concur.
So we've got to find the tools and the weapons to bring that about.
Parallel process. We got attorneys, we got folks in political positions, we have folks in criminal justice, we have folks social service down on the ground. We've all got to show up for this one. And everybody else out there that's interested. We need to show up for this.
Why the absentia? Why aren't enough? We used to have a word in the community where I grew up called jive.
Yeah, we have a lot of words that mean the same thing, you know. I think that, again, that we, you know, he who is in the frame cannot see the picture. You know, that is largely what it is, you know. And then there's some folks that say, there's no picture at all, you know. So we've got to get at the very root of things. And again, it's okay for us not to agree. It's okay for us not to, you know, because we're all different people. But
Okay.
we got to understand that what's in the frame.
There just isn't enough time ever to
Never.
talk to you.
There's never.
We're out of it. Thanks for being with us.
You're welcome.
Thanks for being with us.